The encrypted message flashed on my screen. $50,000 or your secret romance with Elena goes public. My hands shook as I traced the IP address, only to realize the breach came from inside my own office. The server room door slammed shut behind me, locking me in with the evidence. My best friend Mark was the only one who could help. Until I saw the jagged scar on his forearm. The same scar I'd glimpsed on the masked man who just tried to kill me in the parking garage. The drafting tube in my hand was my only weapon. One wrong move, and my career, and my life, were over. The blue glow of the monitor stung David Miller's eyes as the clock struck 2:14 a.m. A single notification pinged, slicing through the low, electric hum of the central heating. He clicked the icon, his pulse thrumming in his throat like a frantic, rhythmic drum. The cursor flickered over a grainy screenshot of his private messages with Emily, her laughter captured in a digital freeze frame he thought he had deleted months ago. Below the image, heavy block text demanded $50,000 by Friday. If he failed, the file would land in the inbox of every partner at Miller and Associates. A sour taste of copper flooded David's mouth. His fingertips went numb against the mechanical keyboard. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, the polished wood grain digging into his palms. If this leaked, his blueprint for the new city library, his legacy, would crumble into a scandal of broken ethics and shattered trust. He lived his life by the math of structural integrity. A single flaw in the foundation meant the eventual collapse of the entire spire. Now, the flaw wasn't in his steel beams, but in a ghost from his past. He stood, his chair scraping against the hardwood with a jagged screech that echoed through the empty house. The air in the home office suddenly lacked oxygen, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the ozone of overworked electronics. He needed the source. He needed the logs. David grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door, the metal cold and biting against his skin. He stepped onto his porch, the Chicago wind whipping a flurry of dry leaves across his shoes. Before he reached his car, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth riverstone. With practiced, obsessive precision, he flipped it 10 times, clack, 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 against his palm. 10 flips. The math was right. The world would hold together for one more hour. The drive to the office was a blur of sickly orange streetlights and the smell of wet asphalt. The city loomed over him like a jagged iron cage, the gray clouds pressing down until the skyscrapers seemed to groan under the weight of the atmosphere. David accelerated, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind racing through the logic of the threat. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the breach. Someone had bypassed his personal walls, and in David's world, a breach was a death sentence. Inside the architectural firm's lobby, the silence was absolute, save for the heavy thud of his own boots on the marble. He bypassed the elevators, opting for the stairs, his breath hitching as he reached the third-floor server room. He swiped his badge. The lock clicked with the sound of a bone snapping. The temperature inside the server room dropped 15 degrees. It was a temple of cold glass and brushed steel, smelling of scorched dust and the sterile chill of high-speed cooling fans. Rows of blinking green lights mocked him, casting rhythmic shadows across the perforated floor tiles. David pulled the main console tray out, the metal sliding with a hiss. His breath hitched as he scrolled through the access history. He wasn't looking for a complex hack from a foreign land. He was looking for a footprint. There it was, a ghost login from an internal terminal. Someone hadn't kicked the door down from the outside. Someone had used a keycard right here on the third floor. The realization made the hair on his arms stand up. The traitor was already inside the house. David leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting in his glasses. He began to harvest the raw data, the strings of numbers flowing like a river of ink. He needed the specific signature of the machine that had sent the message. His fingers flew across the keys, the rhythmic tapping the only sound against the constant drone of the fans. He managed to isolate a partial address, a digital breadcrumb leading back into the heart of the office network. The air felt even thinner now. He felt the weight of the building above him, thousands of tons of concrete and steel held up by the very principles he was now accused of violating. He finished the download, the drive warm in his hand as he pulled it from the slot. He needed to leave. He needed to think. He headed back toward the parking garage, the shadows stretching long and thin under the flickering fluorescent tubes. The garage was a cavern of damp concrete and the smell of old exhaust. As David reached his sedan, a movement in the corner of his eye made him freeze. A figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. The man was tall, his face obscured by a dark mask, his posture aggressive. In his hand, he swung a heavy tire iron, the metal whistling through the air. "Give me the drive, Miller," the man growled, his voice muffled but heavy with a localized Chicago accent. David didn't wait. He didn't have a gun, but he had his heavy cardboard drafting tube slung over his shoulder. A thick, reinforced cylinder containing the master plans for the library. As the assailant lunged, swinging the iron in a wide, murderous arc, David stepped into the blow. He used the tube like a staff, parrying the strike with a dull thud that vibrated up his arms. The attacker stumbled, surprised by the resistance. David didn't give him a second chance. He shoved the end of the tube into the man's chest, driving him back toward a row of heavy metal trash cans. The man crashed into the bins with a deafening clatter of shifting steel and glass. For a moment, the assailant scrambled, his sleeve catching on a jagged edge of a bin, tearing the fabric. David saw a flash of skin, a jagged, angry scar running down the man's forearm. The attacker hissed in pain, looked at David, and then turned, sprinting toward the exit ramp. The sound of his heavy boots faded into the distance, leaving David alone in the echoing silence of the garage, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stood there for a long minute, gasping for air that tasted of oil and cold stone. He looked down at his drafting tube. It was dented, the blueprints inside likely crinkled, but he was alive. He reached into his pocket and gripped the riverstone, flipping it once, twice, 3 times. He needed to find Mark. Mark was the only one who could help him make sense of the math. The old anchor was a quiet diner on the edge of the loop, the kind of place where the coffee was burnt and the booth smelled of vinyl and decades of cigarette smoke. David sat in the far corner, his back to the wall, watching the door. When Mark Sullivan walked in, he looked exactly as he always did. Disarmingly handsome, wearing a tailored wool coat that cost more than David's first car. Mark flashed his wide-toothed smile. Though as he sat down, David noticed his eyes remained cold, scanning the room with a hunter's precision. "You look like you've been through a structural collapse, Dave," Mark said, sliding into the booth. He reached out and touched David's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that felt slightly too heavy. Mark checked his watch, a gold Breitling. He tapped the glass. "I'm 5 minutes early. You know the rule. Time is the only thing you can't buy back." David pushed a manila folder across the table. "Someone's trying to bury me, Mark. I went to the server room. I found a trace." Mark opened the folder, his eyes darting across the printed logs. "Blackmail? Over Emily? Jesus, Dave. I told you that digital stuff was a liability. It's all just ones and zeros until someone turns them into a noose." I was attacked in the garage, David whispered, leaning in. The smell of Mark's expensive cologne, something like sandalwood and cold rain, filled the space between them. A guy with a tire iron. He wanted the data. Mark shook his head, looking concerned. You're lucky you're not in a suburban morgue. Did you see his face? No, David said. But I got a piece of him. As David spoke, Mark reached for his coffee mug. As he tilted his arm, the cuff of his white dress shirt slid back just an inch. David's breath caught in his lungs. There, on the underside of Mark's forearm, was a fresh, jagged red mark. A tear in the skin that looked exactly like the one he'd seen in the garage. David felt the world tilt. The diner, the smell of grease, the sound of the waitress clinking silverware, it all felt like a simulation. He looked at the scar, then up at Mark's unblinking eyes. Mark noticed the gaze. He didn't flinch. He simply pulled his sleeve down and smiled. We're going to fix this, buddy, Mark said, his voice smooth as polished marble. We're a team, always have been. The vibration of the phone on the table sounded like a chainsaw in the quiet diner. David looked down. A new message from the Elena account. They have me, David. They took me from the street in Manhattan. If you don't wire the $50,000 to the escrow account in 60 minutes, I'm dead, and your life is over anyway. Look at the timer. A bright red countdown appeared on the screen. 59:59. 59:58. David felt a cold sweat break across his neck. They have her, Mark. They kidnapped Emily. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the tile. We can't do this here. My apartment has the dedicated line, the high-speed gear. We can track the signal before the clock hits 0. Come on, Dave. Move. They sprinted to Mark's car, a black European sedan that smelled of new leather and lavender air freshener. As they tore through the Chicago streets, the city seemed to close in on them. The skyscrapers were no longer buildings. They were pillars of a cage. David sat in the passenger seat, his hand deep in his pocket, flipping the stone frantically. 1, 2, 3. He lost count. He started over. 1, 2, 3. Mark's apartment was a temple of false comfort. Plush rugs, warm amber lighting, and a view of the skyline that made everyone outside look like ants. But as David stepped inside, he noticed something odd. The air was thick, suffocatingly sweet with the scent of lavender, masking a faint, metallic odor beneath. In the study, Mark commanded, pointing toward a heavy mahogany door at the end of a narrow hallway. The terminal is already live. Get in there and start the trace. I'm going to call a contact I have at the precinct. David stepped into the study, It was a claustrophobic room, the walls lined with filing cabinets that had been moved inward, leaving only a narrow path to the desk. He sat at the computer, his fingers trembling as he reached for the mouse. Click. The sound wasn't from the computer. It was from the door behind him. David spun around. The heavy mahogany door was shut. He lunged for the handle and twisted. It didn't budge. The deadbolt had engaged with a heavy, electronic thud. Mark, David shouted, pounding on the wood. Mark, the door's stuck. No answer. Only the sound of the wind whistling against the high-rise windows. Then, a new sound. A sharp, shattering crack. David turned toward the window. A man was swinging into the room from a rappelling line, his boots shattering the glass into 1,000 diamonds. The intruder landed heavily, rolling across the carpet. He stood up, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The silver blade flicked open with a sound like a predator's hiss. David recognized him. He was the debt collector Mark had complained about weeks ago, a man named Robert with knuckles scarred from 100 negotiations. Robert didn't speak. He just breathed heavily through his nose, a wet, rhythmic sound like a steam engine. He began to count the ceiling tiles, his eyes darting upward before he fixed David with a murderous stare. "Mark sent me to clean up the math, Miller," Robert whispered. David backed away, his heels hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. He looked for a weapon. His eyes landed on a heavy brass desk lamp, a solid piece of mid-century design. As Robert lunged, the knife aimed at David's throat. David swung the lamp with every ounce of terror-fueled strength he possessed. The brass base caught Robert square in the temple. There was a sickening crunch, and the man's eyes rolled back in his head. Robert collapsed like a tower with a failed foundation, his head hitting the floor with a dull thud. The switchblade skittered across the rug, disappearing under a cabinet. David stood over him, gasping, the brass lamp still clutched in his white-knuckled hand. He was shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. He turned back to the door, using the heavy base of the lamp to smash against the lock mechanism. He hammered at the wood, the splinters flying, the scent of mahogany filling the air. Finally, the mechanism gave way. He burst into the living room, ready to fight, ready to run. But the apartment was empty. The silence was deafening. On the glass coffee table, Mark's tablet sat face up, its screen glowing. David approached it slowly, his boots crunching on stray shards of glass that had blown in from the study. He looked down at the screen. A messaging app was open. The user profile at the top read, Elena. David's heart stopped. He scrolled up. Every message he had ever received from the woman he thought he loved, every "I miss you," every "don't tell anyone about us," every blackmail threat was right there. Sent from this device, sent from this room. There was no Emily. There was no hacker. There was only Mark. The realization hit David like a physical blow to the stomach. He slumped against the wall, the cold plaster pressing against his back. For a year, his best friend had been whispering sweet nothings into his ear at night, only to demand $50,000 the next morning. It wasn't just a scam. It was a dissection. A floorboard creaked behind him. David turned. Mark was standing in the kitchen archway, a glass of vintage red wine in his hand. He looked relaxed, almost bored. "You were always too focused on the bolts, David," Mark said, taking a slow sip. "You never looked at the person holding the wrench. Why?" David's voice was a ragged whisper. "Because you have everything," Mark snapped, the mask of the friend finally falling away, to reveal a face twisted by decades of resentment. "You had the Ivy League school. You had the firm. You had the name. My mother died in a shelter while you were learning how to build monuments to yourself. I wanted to see if I could break you from the inside out. I wanted to see if your perfect math could handle a little human error." David lunged at him, a roar of pure betrayal tearing from his throat. They collided in the kitchen, crashing against the stainless steel refrigerator. Mark was stronger, his movements fluid and practiced. He grabbed David by the throat, his fingers digging into the muscle. David managed to twist away, grabbing a heavy glass carafe from the counter and smashing it against Mark's shoulder. Wine and glass exploded everywhere, staining Mark's white shirt like a massive, blooming wound. Mark growled, reaching into his pocket. He didn't pull out a knife. He pulled out a small black device. Zap. The taser hit David square in the chest. 2 metal barbs bit into his skin, and 50,000 volts of electricity surged through his nervous system. David's muscles locked. His vision turned into a strobe light of white agony. He collapsed to the floor, his head hitting the tile with a sound that felt like the end of the world. He lay there, paralyzed, his lungs refusing to draw air. He could smell burned hair and ozone. Mark stood over him, looking down with a clinical detachment. Don't worry, Dave, Mark said, adjusting his tie. The paralysis only lasts a few minutes, just long enough for the show to start. Mark dragged David's limp body into the living room, propping him up against the sofa. He turned on the massive wall-mounted monitor. You thought the blackmail was the play? Mark laughed, a dry, hollow sound. That was just the distraction. While you were busy crying over a girl who didn't exist, I was busy with your digital signature. The screen flashed to life. David's eyes widened. It was a series of architectural contracts, huge municipal projects, bridges, hospitals. And there, at the bottom of every page, was David's official digital seal and signature. These are fake, David managed to wheeze, his voice returning in a painful rasp. To you? Yes, Mark said, scrolling through the documents. But to the IRS and the district attorney, they look like $20 million in embezzled funds moved through offshore accounts in your name. I've been building this paper trail for a year, Dave. I'm the architect now, and I've designed a prison just for you. Mark walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. I've already set the system. If you try to leave, if you try to call the cops, the entire server cache uploads to the authorities. You'll be behind bars before the sun comes up. He tapped a button on his phone. A series of heavy, motorized deadbolts slid into place on every door and window in the apartment. The smart home hummed, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle David's very bones. You're a prisoner in a masterpiece, David, Mark whispered. Enjoy the view. David sat on the floor, his body still tingling from the shock. He looked at the contracts, then at the river stone that had fallen out of his pocket. It lay on the rug, a small gray dot in a world of high-tech betrayal. He realized then that Mark was right about one thing. He had been too focused on the bolts. He had been looking at the digital world as if it were separate from the physical one. But David was an architect. He knew how buildings were made, and more importantly, he knew how they failed. He looked toward the kitchen. He remembered the blueprints for this building. He had consulted on the renovation of this very block 5 years ago. This wasn't just a luxury apartment. It was an old industrial shell. And old shells had secrets. David feigned a sob, burying his face in his hands. You win, Mark. Just give me a minute. Mark smirked, turning back to the monitor to begin deleting the Elena logs, erasing the only proof of his own involvement. Take all the time you need, Dave. You've got the rest of your life. David crawled toward the kitchen, his movements slow and pathetic. Mark ignored him, distracted by his own digital cleanup. Once inside the kitchen, David's demeanor changed. He reached under the sink, his fingers searching for the main gas line. A bypass he knew was poorly reinforced during the 2018 retrofit. He found the heavy metal valve. He didn't turn it all the way. He just cracked it. The hiss was immediate, a sharp, serpentine sound. The smell of rotten eggs began to fill the small space. Then, David reached for a heavy pipe wrench from the emergency kit under the counter. He struck the copper pipe leading to the stove, creating a localized spark and a rhythmic clang, clang, clang. The apartment's safety sensors went berserk. A piercing, high-pitched wail erupted from the ceiling, the fire alarm. Red lights began to strobe, turning the living room into a vision of hell. What did you do? Mark screamed, lunging toward the kitchen. The building's failing, Mark, David shouted over the alarm. Bad math. The gas pressure is spiking. In the chaos and the blinding red light, Mark hesitated. He looked at the stove, then at the door. That second of hesitation was all David needed. He dove behind the decorative wood paneling near the pantry, a spot he knew housed the building's original maintenance hatch. He kicked the panel. It gave way with a splintering groan. He scrambled into the dark, dusty throat of the building, the smell of 40-year-old soot filling his lungs. He climbed the oily ladder rungs, his palms slick with grease, as Mark's curses faded below him. David didn't run to the street. He ran to the one place where the math still mattered. He reached the firm's server room 20 minutes later, his clothes torn, his face smeared with ash. He bypassed the security. He knew the physical overrides that no digital lock could stop. He sat at the main console, the cooling fans screaming around him. He didn't just look for the contracts. He looked for the origin. He traced the Elena messages back through the internal relay, finding the hidden partition in Mark's private drive. And there, buried in a folder encrypted with a date from 10 years ago, he found the final piece of the collapse. Mark hadn't just been faking a girlfriend. He had posed as David's divorce lawyer 3 years ago, using a burner account to manipulate the settlement, ensuring David lost his savings so he would be forced to take on the phantom projects Mark had designed. It was a total structural demolition. David's fingers flew. He didn't delete the files. He mirrored them. He sent the entire cache, the forgeries, the Elena logs, the divorce manipulation, directly to the FBI's white-collar crime division and the Chicago PD. He watched the progress bar crawl. 98%, 99%, 100% sent. David walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk. Across the street, the lights of Mark's luxury high-rise flickered. 10 minutes later, the silent night was shattered by the rhythmic wail of sirens. Blue and red lights danced off the glass facades as 4 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of Mark's building. David watched as they led Mark out in handcuffs. Mark looked diminished, his expensive shirt ruined, his unblinking eyes finally darting with fear. As the officers shoved him into the back of a car, Mark caught David's gaze. David didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just reached into his pocket and gripped the riverstone. The police cleared the scene, the sirens fading into the distance. David stood alone on the corner of Michigan Avenue. The wind was cold, smelling of rain and the lake. People brushed past him, commuters, tourists, lovers, all of them wrapped in their own digital worlds, their thumbs scrolling, their eyes fixed on glowing screens. David looked at his own phone. It buzzed with a notification, a news alert, a text from a colleague, a weather update. Each sound made him flinch. Each vibration felt like a spark against his skin. He had won. The math was corrected. The foundation was clear. But as he looked at the faces in the crowd, he realized the architecture of his life had changed forever. He saw a man in a suit identical to Mark's, and his heart skipped a beat. He saw a woman laughing at a phone screen, and he felt a wave of nausea. He had saved his career, but he had lost the ability to stand in the shade of another person's shadow without looking for the cracks. David Miller turned and began to walk. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the stone in his pocket, the only thing he could trust in a world built on lies.